I'm now going to try and add some more detail to this picture. I'm going to be covering a lot of ground, and in light of what Mike said earlier about Lord Stern's comments, I'm definitely not going to underplay the challenge here, but I will try and give you some reasons for modest optimism. These are the questions that I'm going to be addressing. Where's the carbon? What's the progress so far? Where will it be in future? But first, I need to set out the context. As last week, the context for this conference changed completely as the Paris Agreement came into force. I assume you'll already be familiar with the UK's climate targets, an 80% reduction by 2050, which is about 160 megatons of CO2 equivalent for a territorial basis. And as Mike mentioned, we've got the target of halving built environment emissions over the course of the next decade, which really is just consistent with the carbon budgets we've set. But the goals of the Paris Agreement go well beyond this. Let me be clear, the global goal is no longer just substantial reductions in carbon, the goal is net zero emissions. That's what the Paris Agreement sets out, and the government's already intimated that this objective will enter UK law. The question's not whether, but how. Last month, the Committee on Climate Change, which I'll refer to as the other CCC for the rest of this to avoid confusion, released a report on what this means for UK targets. And albeit they didn't recommend any immediate changes to the targets, they have indicated that new targets will be required in due course. And if the UK is to contribute its fair share to a 2-degree world, then we must be living in a net zero nation shortly after mid-century. What does a net zero nation look like? Well, this is the CCC's best depiction so far. In essence, all sectors that can get close to zero are close to zero, and any emissions that are remaining will need to be offset with these so-called negative emission technologies. Now, with the limited scope for afforestation in the UK, that's principally expected to be biomass with carbon capture and storage at the moment. That's essentially harvesting crops that capture CO2 in their growth, burning them, capturing and storing the resultant emissions. So far, this technology is only fitted on one large-scale facility in the US, capturing about 1/6 of the emissions at pretty high expense. And the CCC estimate, or the other CCC, estimate that it would cost between $70 and $250 a tonne to apply it in the UK. So the report's main message is really simple. The more we can mitigate in sectors we understand, like construction, the less we depend upon these expensive and unproven technologies to deliver the Paris Agreement. Now, just in case you think BECCS is some fancy technology that's unique to UK pathways, it's already baked into most global pathways for 2 degrees. This is the range of current model projections. You'll note the 15 gigaton shortfall between, at the top in the grey there, our current national contributions and the 2-degree trajectory, plus this long-term dependence upon negative emission technologies. What this means is that the UK will not and cannot be alone in pursuing net zero emissions. All other developed countries essentially will be chasing net zero on similar timeframes. So what does that mean for construction? Well, that's the important question. What it means is that many construction projects currently in planning must operate within this future net zero UK. Any emissions that aren't designed out now will likely need to be offset in future at high expense using a technology like BECCS. So from a national perspective, clearly it's much more cost effective to address those emissions now. Now this new carbon context really means that it's no longer a distant problem. A goal of net zero by mid-century means that decisions made by those of you in the room today will fundamentally determine the viability of our national and global targets. So where is the carbon in construction? Well, 2 major reports have attempted to answer this question, as have both been mentioned, the route map, which set out the steps required to achieve an 80% reduction, and the infrastructure carbon review, which really stressed the requisite leadership, communication and culture change. However, it's important to note that the boundaries for these reports weren't the same, and the methodologies that were used are still under development. There's still a lot we don't know, but what I'm going to try and do is very quickly give you an overview of our current understanding. So here's the big picture. Top bar is UK reported emissions on a territorial basis, so that's those emitted within UK borders, and that grey bar is what the CCC, the Committee on Climate Change, reckons we have to be aiming for. Now, the assessments below the dotted line are on a consumption basis. That means it includes the impact of imported products and excludes exports. Now, that approach makes sense for construction because of our dependence on a lot of imported products, about half our steel, most our aluminium, and so on. The 2 major assessments I mentioned, infrastructure carbon review, low carbon route map, are at the bottom. Now, the infrastructure carbon review considered only energy, transport, water waste and telecoms, including the cap carb of building infrastructure assets, op carb of running and maintaining those assets, and the use carb from end users of those assets, and you can see how they split there. Meanwhile, the route map focused on this built environment definition, which included the cap card of building and maintaining domestic, non-domestic and infrastructure assets, and op-carb of those built environment assets. So that includes things like home heating, but excludes the transport chunk. So if we consider the immediate challenge facing us as a nation, clearly energy and transport, the chunks in green and blue, are the largest contributors and the priority for mitigation efforts. And that's what we're already doing. Average carbon intensity has dropped about 20% in the last 5 years. We've had a much faster uptake of low carbon vehicles, and these trends will continue. The infrastructure industry must deliver these improvements, but control over the speed of progress primarily lies elsewhere. The longer term challenge is essentially to get these blue and green chunks down to near zero as soon as possible and then squeeze everything else into that grey box. That's the scale of the challenge that's facing us, and that's going to require reductions in capital carbon and actions from all sectors of industry. It's also important that we consider the trend and timing of these emissions. Now, although as an industry, as Tim mentioned, we must focus on reducing whole life impacts across a stock of assets, we must also consider the impacts of adding to this stock upon global carbon budgets. Now, over recent years, what we've seen is a slow reduction in operational carbon being offset by an increase in capital carbon as outputs increased coming out of the recession. Now, in real terms, the real costs in terms of impact and adaptation of a tonne of carbon emitted today are higher than one emitted sometime in the future. Yet today we still often mistakenly place a greater financial value on this future carbon on the assumption that the price is going to rise. Now that practice has to change. And if our national strategy is to deliver a lot of new infrastructure over the next decade, then we must focus on reducing cap carb now, in addition to these emphasis on energy and transport use carb. Unfortunately, our current understanding of cap carb distribution is still limited. Here's a quick kind of overview picture. There's still more work to be done on understanding how this pans out. The bulk of cap carb, as mentioned by Chris, is really on the materials side, although a substantial chunk is also from on-site construction activities. Now, presentations this afternoon are going to discuss how these can be reduced in more detail. Here's the equivalent picture for op-carb and the picture for use carb. These slides will be available afterwards, as should a video of this presentation, so if I'm going a bit quick for you, you can go back and look at them afterwards. So what progress have we made so far in reducing these emissions? Well, at the end of 2015, as Paul mentioned, I co-authored this route map update with ARP, which showed we're already falling behind the target trajectory. That route map update covered up to 2012. What I've added to this graph here is 2013 and where we reckon 2014-15 might come in. The bad news is that as an industry, we're behind our targets. The good news is that individual firms that have seriously pursued carbon in the interim period have made more rapid and deeper reductions than were thought possible by the route map authors. So what we're seeing with actions of the sort Chris was talking about is that if you effectively align supply chains, you can deliver these innovations that were not previously envisioned. So that means it is possible to get back on this trajectory, but we're only going to do it by getting more of the industry working together. There's been a lot of recent progress also in carbon assessment practice. Past 2080, a lot of new EPD data and so forth. Other speakers throughout the day will cover these issues in more detail. In spite of this, there's still a lot of work to be done, particularly transferring knowledge between infrastructure and building designers. We can't have a situation where the construction industry sees itself in all these little parcels and doesn't talk to each other. We need to get in what the best practice in buildings is and the best practice in infrastructure, and we need to get them talking to each other. Particularly, we also need to work on more cross-industry action to ensure adequate drivers are forthcoming. Where's the carbon going to be in future? Well, the infrastructure carbon review set out a high-level analysis. This is the best-case scenarios that they'd predicted. The challenge with this is that's adopting the highest possible level of known measures when the infrastructure carbon review is prepared. And that still leaves infrastructure taking up 93% of the UK's carbon space by 2050, which really doesn't leave much room for these other hard-to-treat sectors like aviation and agriculture. If you go back to that grey box challenge I was setting before, you've got to think everyone's competing for that small space within that grey box. So we need to ask ourselves as an industry, can we do more? Well, the good news is that the recent National Needs Assessment provided a much more detailed depiction of possible demands, and intriguingly, the carbon results varied substantially. It really demonstrated what Tim was stressing about this need for having a greater understanding of local considerations and interactions across this system of systems. So for example, they came up with about double the potential reductions in transport emissions by increasing this systems focus and by looking at demand management as well. In the shorter term, the big high-profile projects we've got are really important for demonstrating carbon reduction and driving changes in practice throughout the industry, and really for understanding what the realistic potential is for the broader industry as a whole. In addition to that analysis that I mentioned that CMAP, the centre that I'm based in, produced for the CCC, we also have run a bunch of scenarios for CapCarb. So this is 27 scenarios, the grey lines there. And they're based on growth from the Treasury, population from ONS, households from DCLG, and so on. So these are the realistic range of what we're planning for. These are not extreme scenarios. And this analysis included projected improvements in grid intensity. Decarbonising the grid alone will not take care of this challenge for us. And it compared it with the interim targets that were set out in the route map. Now, these results really highlight the industry's dependence upon a number of external factors, principally the overall level of construction output, whether or not CCS becomes viable, and whether or not we proceed at the rate of grid decarbonisation that we're expecting. Now, these factors will vary, but our carbon budgets are absolute. Now, what that means is that if we proceed along a very low level of output and we consider a sort of best case from a carbon point of view scenario where we decarbonise the grid really fast and CCS becomes viable, then really over the next decade all we really need to do is spread best practice. We don't really need to go beyond that. But if we want to produce more, if we want to be building at levels that were higher than in the recession, if we want to deliver all this new infrastructure, and we're sceptical about how quickly CCS can be deployed, and we're sceptical about the rate of progress we're seeing on grid decarbonisation, then we have to go much further. Now, that could mean designers are really faced with radical changes in a decade or so. So that means we have to start developing these solutions for CapCarb now, in addition to focusing on OpCarb and use carb from energy and transport. So what opportunities does this new carbon context present, this net zero context that I've set out? Well, at a global level, construction firms in these 14 countries alone are over 4 gigatons of supply chain emissions. Now, I suspect many of you in the room will operate across a number of these markets. Imagine, just for a moment, if achievements of the UK leaders like Chris's group, Anglian Water, imagine if you could replicate those kind of savings elsewhere. A proliferation of UK best practice in construction could potentially be a gigaton solution at the global scale. That's serious mitigation opportunity there. And as most other developed countries are also going to be pursuing these net zero goals, there will be opportunities to export this low carbon expertise and products to these markets. Now, if we're going to meet the construction 2025 target that Mike didn't mention, the fourth one, about a 50% increase in exports, then this is a market that the UK has to lead. Now, in areas such as low carbon design, you could say the UK is already a leader, but we're going to face increased competition. The French, Dutch, Germans, Swedes, Norwegians, Australians, Americans, Canadians, even some projects in Qatar are targeting whole life carbon reduction. And firms in these countries are already developing the sorts of solutions that we're going to be talking about later today. Now, some of these countries already have more ambitious national mitigation targets in place and look set to implement fairly substantial drivers for industries like construction. So we're going to have to raise our game if we want the UK to stay ahead on this. So in summary, the Paris Agreement's created a new carbon context. The UK goal is no longer an 80% reduction in emissions, but net zero emissions. And the CCC, or the other CCC, has set out a future vision for achieving this. And infrastructure projects that are under design now have to be consistent with that vision. Anything we don't mitigate in our designs today, we're going to have to offset at high expense later this century. So there's no time to lose. Our progress so far shows that a small number of firms acting in isolation is not enough to tackle the scale of challenge that we face. So we need to act now and act together. Thank you.